The mayor made my grandma's biker friends abandon her. Now she's living her dreams because of it. Every morning for 12 years, the same 5 ex-cons would roll their motorcycles up to my grandmother's bakery at exactly 7 a.m. She'd taught them to read in the prison literacy program, and when they got out, they never forgot Mrs. Rose, who treated them like humans. Everyone in town knew nobody messed with Rose's bakery, not with Carlos and his crew drinking coffee on the front stoop. Then Mayor Quimby decided they were bad optics for his re-election campaign. At the town meeting, he spoke in that practiced politician voice, all fake concern. We need to protect our elderly residents like Mrs. Rose from potential gang violence. My grandmother stood up immediately. These men are my friends, not some gang. But Quimby cut her off. I understand you're scared to speak against them publicly, Mrs. Rose. Don't worry, we'll protect you. 3 days later, Quimby showed up at my grandmother's bakery personally. He ordered a coffee, and while doing so, he leaned close to my grandmother. Off the record, I'd hate to see your liability insurance get investigated if someone gets hurt because you harbor known criminals. When my grandmother refused to budge, even handing out coffee to the bikers for free as protest, Quimby decided to punish her. He assigned a health inspector to come visit with his clipboard. Random inspection, he announced, finding 17 violations that hadn't existed the day before. That'll be $2,000, he declared. Oh, and those bikers can't sit at your outdoor tables anymore. Health code. My grandmother called me crying, neither of us knowing at that point that this happening was a blessing in disguise. 2 days after that, 3 of the bikers got arrested for loitering while helping grandmother carry flour bags from her truck. Bails set at $10,000 each, the judge, a friend of Quimby, said. None of us could afford it, and even worse, the arrested bikers were facing up to 3 years because of their criminal past. That's when Quimby made his move. He visited Grandma's bakery again, this time with an offer. I can make those charges disappear. Your remaining friends just need to leave voluntarily. Grandmother's hand shook as she poured his coffee, but her voice was steady. Get out of my shop. But she didn't say no. I could tell she was cracking. The day after another $1,000 fine, the bikers started distancing themselves because they didn't want to cause my grandmother more trouble. That's when it happened. Coincidentally, the day they left, a teenager with the knife showed up at closing time. He broke grandmother's wrist as he grabbed $4,000 from the register. She was in the hospital bed, still crying from the pain when Quimby arrived with flowers and a reporter. But instead of focusing on the crime or finding the suspect, he twisted the narrative. This is exactly why we need the Clean Streets Initiative, he told the camera. Poor Mrs. Rose was too afraid to tell these bikers to leave. 2 more bikers got arrested outside their own apartments for armed robbery. Then Quimby's assistant photographed the remaining bikers at a gas station. The next day, their employers all received warnings about harboring criminals. 3 lost their jobs. When police knocked on Carlos's door at 3 a.m. with an anonymous tip about weapons, they found his legal hunting knife. Possession while on parole, they said. You're looking at 5 years. The last biker got served with a restraining order banning him from the entire downtown district. My grandmother was left completely alone. We still didn't realize the gold mine that was waiting for us. I remember trying to grasp at straws at that point. My grandmother was talking about just shutting the bakery down because she'd grown so used to the bikers, and I couldn't allow that. I started looking through old photos, files, looking for something. That's when in her 1985 4th grade class photo, I spotted a gap-toothed girl named Helen Williams. She looked familiar, so I Googled the name and nearly dropped my phone. Helen Williams was now the governor. I wrote a letter to her explaining everything, and miraculously got a response 2 days later. When I visited the hospital to show my grandmother the letter, her face changed to hysterical laughter. She was happier than I'd seen her in genuine years. She instantly wrote Mayor Quimby an apology letter, telling him he was right, and that she was inviting him to the bakery to personally thank him for making her realize the bikers were doing more harm than good. She had a big smile the whole time writing the letter. Quimby wrote back immediately. 3 days later, he strutted into the bakery with his assistant and reported broadcasting live at 10 a.m. One of those famous cinnamon rolls from the cleanest bakery in town, he said loudly. He glanced at grandmother's cast. That's when the roar of motorcycles suddenly filled the street. Everyone except me and Grandma were shocked, and Quimby's face immediately lit up. Call the police. Those idiots just earned themselves prison time. Unfortunately for Quimby, that's when Governor Williams herself walked through the door wearing a leather jacket. My grandmother gasped. Helen? Helen Williams from 4th grade? The governor nodded. Mrs. Rose, you taught me to read when I was 9 years old. Time I returned the favor. She turned to Quimby. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. Quimby's coffee cup shattered on the floor. He looked at the bikers surround him, the broadcast recording his humiliation live, and decided if he was going down, Grandma's bakery was going down with him. I'll never forget what he did next. He grabbed the microphone from the reporter's hand and pointed straight at Carlos. His voice came out loud and shaky. They attacked me. These criminals put their hands on me. I need them arrested right now for assault on a public official. The officers started moving toward the bikers, and Carlos took a step back with his hands up. The camera was still rolling and capturing everything. Governor Williams stepped right between the police and Carlos. Her voice cut through all the noise. "Stand down. Nobody moves until we sort this out properly." The officers stopped but kept their hands near their belts. Quimby kept pointing and yelling about being assaulted and threatened. The governor turned to face him. "Any removal of these citizens requires due process and proper charges, not theatrical accusations during what appears to be a publicity stunt." Quimby's face went bright red. The broadcast was live and everyone could see him getting called out by the governor on camera. He recovered fast, though, leaning over to his assistant and whispering urgent instructions I couldn't hear. The assistant pulled out his phone and started typing fast. I yanked my phone from my pocket and started recording everything from my angle. My hands were shaking, but I kept the camera steady on Quimby and the officers. I turned to the people standing around watching. "Please send me any videos you got. This is important. We need every angle of what just happened." 3 people nodded and pulled out their phones. Mrs. Rose was shaking really bad next to me. Her good hand was gripping the counter edge and her face had gone pale. I helped her into one of the chairs away from all the yelling and chaos. She grabbed my hand hard enough that it hurt. The bakery felt too small with all these people crammed inside. The camera crew was still filming, and Quimby was still talking to his assistant in quick whispers. By afternoon, the whole crowd had cleared out, but we weren't done. Another city inspector showed up at the door with a clipboard and an official-looking vest. He didn't even look around the bakery. He just pulled out papers that were already filled out. Civil nuisance warning, ongoing public disturbances at this location. Bakery is ordered closed pending a full safety review. The paperwork looked pre-printed, except for today's date that was written in pen at the top in messy handwriting. I took out my phone and photographed every single page before I signed the receipt. The inspector left without saying anything else. Mrs. Rose started crying quietly in her chair. The bakery we'd kept open through everything was now officially shut down. The next morning, a courier knocked on my apartment door at 8 a.m. Court documents, thick stack of papers, and an official envelope. I flipped through them with my coffee getting cold on the counter. Emergency restraining order filed by Mayor Quimby, claiming the bikers intimidated him and pose a threat to public officials. The order banned all 5 bikers from coming within 500 feet of City Hall, the bakery, or any business on Main Street. Basically, they couldn't go anywhere in downtown. I called Carlos, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I called the other bikers I had numbers for and got the same thing. They were already gone, scattered and hiding. I spent all of day 2 on the phone calling every legal aid number I could find in the county. Most calls went to voicemail where I left desperate messages trying to explain our situation in 2 minutes. The receptionist who answered sounded skeptical when I said the mayor was targeting us. By evening, my phone finally started buzzing with callbacks. 3 different lawyers or legal groups offered to review the documents if I sent them over. I forwarded everything to all 3 of them through email, hoping at least one would actually help us, and not just look at it and say sorry. On day 3, a lawyer named Naomi Clements called me back. She spent a whole hour on the phone asking detailed questions about the timeline and what evidence we had. When did the first inspection happen? When did the arrests start? What exactly did the mayor say to your grandmother? Do you have any of this recorded or written down? I answered everything as carefully as I could and sent her links to all the videos and photos I'd collected. She was quiet for a minute after I finished. The restraining order has procedural problems, and the targeting pattern is documented enough that I'll take this case pro bono as a civil rights matter. I almost dropped the phone. She told me not to get too excited yet because it would be a long process, but at least we had someone who knew the law on our side now. That same afternoon, I got a message from someone named Jeff Hooper, who said he was a reporter for the county paper. He'd heard about the broadcast incident and wanted to know more. He sounded skeptical about taking on the mayor in his message, but asked if I could send him copies of all the inspection reports and court filings. I sent him everything the same way I'd sent it to Naomi. 2 people paying attention was better than 1. Maybe if enough people knew what was happening, Quimby couldn't just keep doing whatever he wanted. By the end of the first week, things got worse instead of better. Mrs. Rose's wrist pain got bad enough that she couldn't sleep. I took her back to the doctor who looked at the x-rays and scheduled follow-up imaging to check if the bone was healing right. With the bakery closed, we had no income coming in at all. The medical bills were piling up faster than I could count them. Insurance covered some, but not all of it, and we were bleeding money we didn't have. Mrs. Rose kept apologizing like any of this was her fault. I told her to stop, but she couldn't help it. The bikers were scattered now, and I barely heard from them. 3 were still sitting in jail on the excessive bail that none of us could afford to pay. 2 were hiding at friends' places in other towns trying to avoid getting arrested again for just existing. Carlos finally called me from a borrowed phone. His voice sounded tired and scared. "I'm terrified that any contact with you or your grandma will trigger my parole violations, and they'll send me back to prison for years." I told him to stay safe and stay hidden. He said he was sorry for bringing all this trouble down on us. I told him it wasn't his fault, but I don't think he believed me. The call ended, and I sat there staring at my phone, feeling completely alone in this fight. At the start of week 2, my phone rang while I was sorting through medical bills at the kitchen table. The caller ID showed a number from the state capitol. I answered, and a woman introduced herself as Janice from the governor's office. She explained that the governor was keeping track of our situation, but couldn't step in directly with local police work or court cases. She told me to write down everything that happened with dates and times. She warned me not to do anything that could look like revenge or trying to take justice into my own hands because that would hurt our case. I thanked her and hung up, feeling both relieved and frustrated. 2 days later, someone knocked on my apartment door around noon. I opened it to find a man in his 40s wearing khakis and a polo shirt. He said his name was Mateo, and he was the parole officer assigned to Carlos and 2 other bikers. He asked if we could talk privately, so I let him in. He sat at my kitchen table and explained how parole worked in detail. Any small mistake could send someone back to prison immediately. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time counted as a violation, even if they didn't do anything wrong. He seemed uncomfortable explaining all this, but said he had to follow the rules exactly or lose his job. I asked if there was any way to help the bikers stay safe. He said the best thing was for them to stay away from downtown completely and document everywhere they went. After he left, I felt even more trapped by how unfair the system was. The next day, Naomi drove over to Mrs. Rose's house and we all sat down at her kitchen table. Naomi had a legal pad and she wrote down 3 main goals. First, get the bakery legally open again. Second, reduce or beat the criminal charges against the bikers. Third, gather proof that the mayor deliberately abused his power. We talked for over an hour about strategy. Naomi kept emphasizing that we had to follow proper legal procedures even when it felt incredibly slow. She said cutting corners would only hurt us later when we got to court. Mrs. Rose nodded and agreed, even though I could see the frustration in her eyes. During week 3, Naomi filed official motions challenging the restraining order. She also requested a hearing to review the bail amounts. She gave me homework assignments about organizing evidence. I spent entire days creating a detailed archive with timestamps for every document and video. I wrote down witness names and kept careful notes about where each piece of evidence came from. Naomi taught me how to organize everything so it would hold up in court. My apartment turned into a mini office with folders and printed documents covering every surface. I also submitted public records requests to City Hall, asking for all health inspection logs from the past 5 years. I wanted to prove the bakery had never been cited before Quimby started his campaign. The city clerk sent back a letter estimating the processing fees at $847. The letter said it would take 6 weeks to gather the documents. When I showed Naomi, she laughed bitterly and said this was a standard stalling tactic. She filed a motion to reduce the fees based on public interest. Jeff published his first article in the county paper, questioning the timing of everything. He laid out the dates of the enforcement actions and pointed out the unusual bail amounts. Within hours of the article going live, anonymous social media pages popped up attacking us. They called the bikers a criminal gang and accused me of helping dangerous felons threaten honest citizens. The comments were vicious and coordinated. I took screenshots of everything and added them to my evidence archive. Mrs. Rose's wrist wasn't healing right. The doctor looked at new x-rays and said the bone was setting crooked. She needed surgery to reset it properly. I spent my days running between the hospital for intake paperwork, calling insurance companies to argue about coverage, and filling out bakery permit applications. I was exhausted all the time, but I couldn't let myself fall apart because Mrs. Rose needed me to keep functioning. During week 4, Carlos called me from a borrowed phone again. He sounded nervous and spoke quietly. He told me something he'd remembered from months ago. The mayor's assistant had approached him at a gas station and made a weird comment. The assistant hinted that certain problems could go away if the bikers made a cash contribution to the re-election campaign. Carlos had thought it was just sleazy politics at the time and ignored it. Now I realized it was an early shakedown attempt before Quimby escalated to arrests and fines. I wrote down every detail Carlos could remember about the conversation. Janice called me again a few days later. She spoke carefully and said she couldn't give me documents directly, but she mentioned that internal memos existed showing the mayor's office had set enforcement quotas for downtown businesses. These quotas were tied to something called visual improvement metrics for his campaign. She suggested I file specific records requests that might uncover these documents through official channels. She gave me exact phrases to use in my requests. I thanked her and immediately started drafting new public records forms. Finally, Naomi got a small win in court. A judge reviewed the bail situation for one of the bikers and reduced it from $10,000 to $2,500. Naomi had presented character letters from his employer and landlord showing he was stable and not a flight risk. It wasn't much, but it established precedent that the original bail was way too high. This would help the other cases moving forward. We managed to scrape together the reduced bail amount and got one biker out. He looked thinner and scared when he walked out of jail, but he hugged me hard and thanked us for not giving up. 2 days after we got the first biker out, Mateo called and asked to meet at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the bakery. He showed up in plain clothes and sat across from me with his hands folded on the table. He walked me through how the parole system actually worked, pulling out a folder with copies of the rules and regulations. He explained that Carlos's hunting knife was legally purchased and registered, but the paperwork showing he'd declared it to his parole officer 6 months ago got lost in a system transfer. The knife itself wasn't illegal, but the missing paperwork made it look like a violation, and judges almost always sided with the state in those situations. Mateo kept shifting in his seat and looking at his coffee cup while he talked. He told me he knew the rules were being twisted to hurt people who were following them, but if he didn't enforce everything exactly as written, he'd lose his job and someone worse would take over. I thanked him for being honest and asked if there was any way to fix the paperwork problem. He said he'd submit a correction request, but it could take months to process through the bureaucracy. That same afternoon, a man in a suit knocked on the bakery's back door. He handed Mrs. Rose an official-looking envelope and walked away without saying anything. Inside was a nuisance notice from our landlord citing 6 police calls to the property in the past month and warning that our lease might not get renewed when it came up next year. The bakery had been in this building for 15 years, and the rent was locked in at rates we could actually afford. Losing the location would mean starting over somewhere else with higher costs, assuming we could even find a new space and get approved for another lease with all this legal trouble hanging over us. Mrs. Rose sat down at the kitchen table and just stared at the notice for a long time. I made copies of everything and added it to our evidence file. The next morning, I submitted a permit application to hold a community rally outside City Hall. I wanted to organize a public event where supporters could speak up about what was happening and show that people cared about the bakery and the bikers. 3 days later, the application came back denied with a single-sentence explanation, citing safety concerns and crowd control issues. I called Naomi and she said we could fight it, but it would take weeks and probably wouldn't work anyway. She suggested we try something quieter that didn't need a permit. That evening, I posted on social media asking people to join us for sidewalk vigils outside the closed bakery. We'd stand peacefully with candles and offer free coffee to anyone who stopped by, keeping everything legal and calm while still maintaining public attention on the situation. The first vigil happened 2 nights later with about 20 people showing up. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but local residents walked by and asked questions, and a few people took photos that got shared online. During the second week of vigils, I got an anonymous email sent through an encrypted service. The message was short and didn't include any attachments. It said I should look into a storage unit rented by the city on the east side of town where pre-filled violation stickers and blank inspection forms were supposedly kept. The tip didn't provide an address or any proof, just the suggestion that evidence might exist there. My first instinct was to drive over and try to find the place, maybe see if I could look through a window or talk to the storage facility manager. But I called Naomi first, and she shut that idea down immediately. She explained that any evidence I obtained through trespassing or illegal search would be inadmissible in court and could actually hurt our case by making us look desperate and willing to break laws. Instead, she told me to document the tip with exact timestamps and forward it to her through official channels so she could request a legal search warrant if the information checked out. Jeff called me 3 days later sounding excited. He'd been digging through public financial records and found something interesting. The mayor's assistant ran a consulting LLC that received a payment of $15,000 from the Downtown Business Association during the same week that the harassment of Mrs. Rose escalated from fines to arrests. The payment was listed as Community Development Consulting Services, which sounded legitimate on paper, but the timing was suspicious. Jeff explained that this didn't prove corruption by itself, since consulting work was normal, but it established a clear financial motive for the mayor's office to want the bikers gone. The Downtown Business Association had been pushing for a cleaner upscale image for months, and removing what they saw as unsavory elements fit that agenda perfectly. Jeff said he was writing an article connecting the dots, but being careful not to make accusations he couldn't back up with solid evidence. Naomi filed a motion to dismiss the loitering charges against 2 of the bikers using footage from police body cameras. She'd requested the videos through Discovery and spent hours reviewing every angle. The footage clearly showed the bikers carrying 50-pound flour bags from Mrs. Rose's truck into the bakery, not standing around doing nothing. They were obviously helping with legitimate business operations, not loitering. The motion included timestamps and still frames proving the arrests were baseless. I thought this would be a quick win, but the prosecutor filed a response requesting additional time for discovery and depositions. They wanted to interview witnesses and review more evidence before responding to the dismissal request. Naomi explained this was a standard delaying tactic that would drag the process out another month at minimum, keeping the bikers under legal threat and burning through our limited resources. 2 weeks later, Janice called to tell me the governor was organizing a small business roundtable to discuss downtown development issues. She'd gotten Mrs. Rose invited as a participant, along with about a dozen other local business owners. The event would be at the State Building downtown with some media coverage. I was excited because it seemed like a chance to tell our story in a public forum where people would have to listen. But Janice warned me carefully before we went. She said we needed to focus on the business challenges and regulatory problems without directly attacking the mayor by name in front of cameras. If we made it look like political theater or a personal vendetta, it could undermine the legal case and make the governor look like she was taking sides inappropriately. I understood, but it frustrated me because staying diplomatic felt like letting the mayor get away with everything. That night, I set up my phone on a tripod in the bakery kitchen. Mrs. Rose stood in front of the counter where she'd served coffee every morning for 12 years. I hit record and she spoke for exactly 2 minutes. She thanked Carlos and the other bikers for their friendship, talking about teaching them to read in the prison program and watching them build honest lives after release. She mentioned their morning coffee routine and how they'd helped carry supplies and kept an eye on the neighborhood. Her voice stayed steady and genuine the whole time. No dramatics or appeals for sympathy. When she finished, I uploaded the video to every social media platform I could think of with a simple caption explaining what was happening. Within 2 days, the video had been shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in from people across the state saying they supported Mrs. Rose and calling out the mayor's actions. Some people started using hashtags and organizing their own vigils in other towns. Mateo did a routine home visit to check on one of the released bikers the following week. He went to the guy's apartment and saw the normal daily routine, the work schedule posted on the refrigerator, the family photos on the walls. The biker had a steady job doing warehouse work and was helping take care of his elderly mother who lived in the same building. Everything about the visit showed a stable, responsible person trying to follow the rules and build a normal life. Mateo called me afterward from his personal phone and said he'd note in his official reports that the knife registration policy needed clarification. He couldn't explicitly take our side without risking his position, but making that notation was as close as he could get to helping without crossing professional lines. During week 7, I got another encrypted email. This one was from the health inspector who'd written up the original 17 violations. He didn't provide any documents or specific evidence. Instead, he suggested I should look at the pattern of when inspections were scheduled compared to the mayor's campaign events. He wrote that comparing those dates might reveal interesting connections about how enforcement priorities were set. The message was careful and vague, clearly from someone who wanted to help but couldn't risk being identified as a source. I immediately started building a timeline spreadsheet, marking every inspection date for the bakery and cross-referencing them with the mayor's public campaign schedule from his website and social media posts. The pattern jumped out at me within an hour. Every single inspection at the bakery happened within 3 days of a campaign fundraiser or press event where Mayor Quimby talked about cleaning up downtown. I saved the spreadsheet and sent it to Naomi with screenshots of his social media posts showing the exact dates. She called me back that same evening and said we had enough for a whistleblower complaint. Janice walked me through the process over the phone the next morning, explaining exactly what documents we needed and how to phrase everything to trigger a state investigation. We filed the affidavit on Tuesday, requesting internal calendars and email records related to enforcement decisions. Naomi said this put the mayor's office on notice that we were building a corruption case, not just defending against individual charges. The DA called Naomi 3 days later with a plea offer. The bikers could plead no contest to misdemeanor loitering, accept community service, and all the assault claims would disappear. 2 of the bikers wanted to take it immediately because they were exhausted from court dates and scared about their parole status. Carlos refused flat out when Naomi explained the terms. He told her he wouldn't admit to a crime he didn't commit just to make things easier. I drove to his apartment that Saturday to talk it through. He opened the door looking tired and angry, and before I could say anything, he started in on me about turning his life into a political cause. He said I was chasing headlines and using his situation to make myself feel important. His words stung because part of me knew there was truth in them. I tried to explain that we were fighting for the right to exist in our own community without being criminalized, but he just shook his head and said that sounded like something I read on a poster. We argued for 20 minutes before I left, neither of us feeling better about anything. During week 8, I got a call from our alarm company at 3 a.m. saying motion sensors had triggered at the bakery. I drove over to find spray paint all over the front windows with threats about snitches and rats. Someone had smashed the front door lock with what looked like a hammer or crowbar. Our security cameras caught a masked teenager in a dark hoodie breaking the lock and tagging the windows. The build and movement matched the description of the kid who robbed Mrs. Rose months earlier. I called the police and filed a report, then sent the footage to Jeff because I didn't trust the local cops to actually investigate. Jeff spent 2 days digging through social media and found posts from a youth volunteer account that showed someone wearing an identical hoodie at a campaign event for Quimby. The evidence was thin and mostly circumstantial, but it suggested a possible connection between the mayor's operation and both incidents. I wanted to blast the connection all over social media immediately and let people draw their own conclusions. Naomi shut that down hard when I called her. She said accusing a minor based on a hoodie match could backfire legally and make us look reckless and desperate. Instead, she filed for an injunction to stop all targeted code enforcement while the criminal cases were still pending. The emergency hearing happened on a Thursday morning with a different judge than the one who set the original bail. Naomi presented our documentation showing the harassment pattern with dates, amounts, and the correlation to campaign events. The judge reviewed everything for almost an hour before granting a temporary restraining order, preventing the city from conducting any more inspections without clear, probable cause. It wasn't a complete victory, but it gave us breathing room to operate without constant threats hanging over us. Our landlord called that afternoon sounding slightly less aggressive than before. He said he'd hold off on the nuisance complaints for now, but rent would increase significantly at renewal time to cover his increased insurance costs and legal exposure from all the police activity. Naomi and I spent the weekend researching small business grants and community development funds that might help cover the difference when the lease came up. Janice called Monday evening to explain something about state law that I hadn't understood before. She said the governor had authority to suspend a local mayor if probable cause existed for corruption or abuse of office, but the standard required substantial documented evidence, not just accusations or circumstantial connections. We realized our real goal wasn't just winning the criminal cases or getting the bakery reopened. We needed to build a corruption file strong enough to trigger state intervention and remove Quimby from the office entirely. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source. A parking enforcement camera mounted across the street from a coffee shop captured footage of the mayor's assistant meeting with the original judge 2 days before the excessive bail hearing. The timestamp showed them sitting together for 40 minutes, and while the meeting might have been completely innocent, the optics were terrible. Naomi said it gave her grounds to question whether the bail decision had been predetermined through improper contact. She filed a formal inquiry requesting the judge explain the meeting and justify the bail amounts based on the evidence presented in court, rather than outside communications. Within days, Naomi got a response from the state bar saying they were opening a review of the judge's conduct. The whole process felt slow, and I kept checking my phone waiting for updates. Naomi called me 5 days later to explain that the judge decided to step away from all our cases rather than fight the complaint. She said this was actually good news because it meant the Bar Association found enough concern to make him worried. A new judge got assigned to handle everything, someone from the county court who didn't have any connection to the mayor or his friends. The first hearing with the new judge happened 2 weeks after that. Naomi brought all our documentation about the original bail amounts and explained how they were way higher than what similar cases normally got. The new judge spent almost 30 minutes reading through the files and comparing them to other loitering cases from the past year. He looked confused when he saw that people with worse records and more serious charges had gotten bail set at $2,000 or less. The judge reduced the bail to reasonable amounts right there in the courtroom. 2 more bikers were able to post bond that same day and come home. I picked them up outside the jail, and they both looked tired and scared. One of them kept saying he couldn't mess up even once or they'd send him right back. The other one just stared out the window the whole drive and didn't talk much. I understood they were dealing with a lot and didn't push them to open up. Mateo called me the next morning asking if the released bikers needed help finding work that would satisfy their parole requirements. He explained that the county had a program where people on parole could do community service jobs that counted toward their supervision terms. The bikers could help with things like park maintenance or building repairs, and it would keep them employed while following all the rules. I asked if they could work at the bakery doing prep work in the back, where they wouldn't be violating the restraining order about Main Street. Mateo said he'd have to check the exact boundaries, but probably yes, if they stayed in the kitchen area and didn't go near the front. Within a few days, all the released bikers were enrolled in the program. They started coming in early to help mix dough and prep ingredients for the day's baking. Mrs. Rose was so happy to have them back that she cried the first morning they showed up. She kept hugging them and thanking them for not giving up on her. The bikers just smiled and got to work like they'd never left. Then everything got worse again. Mayor Quimby's office released a video clip from the broadcast showing what looked like Carlos shoving the mayor backward. The clip was only about 5 seconds long, and it spread fast on social media. Local news stations picked it up and started running stories about how the bikers had assaulted a public official on camera. People who had been supporting us suddenly started posting angry comments saying the bikers were violent and dangerous. The calls for them to be prosecuted got louder and more aggressive. I watched the clip over and over trying to figure out what happened. Something felt wrong about it, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. The timing seemed off, and the movements didn't match what I remembered from being there in person. Naomi warned me not to make accusations without proof, because it would just make us look desperate. Jeff called me 2 days later sounding excited. He'd gone directly to the TV station and asked to see the original broadcast footage before it got edited. The station manager gave him access to the raw files because Jeff had a good relationship with them from years of reporting. When Jeff compared the raw footage to Quimby's clip, he found that crucial seconds had been removed. The full video showed Quimby deliberately stepping backward into Carlos while the mayor was looking right at him. Carlos hadn't pushed anyone. Quimby had staged the whole thing to make it look like an assault. Jeff wrote a detailed article breaking down the edit frame by frame with screenshots showing exactly what got cut out. His piece explained how the mayor had manipulated the footage to create a false narrative. I felt relieved that we had proof, but also worried because we'd been burned by public opinion so many times before. People believe what they want to believe, and sometimes facts don't matter as much as they should. The State Ethics Board announced they were opening an inquiry into the mayor's conduct the following week. They cited the pattern of selective enforcement against the bakery and possible corruption in how city resources were being used. Naomi had sent them our entire documentation chain showing dates, fines, arrests, and the correlation to campaign events. With multiple witnesses and the video evidence of the staged assault, the case against Quimby was getting stronger. Governor Williams issued a statement saying she was suspending the mayor from the office while the investigation continued. Quimby would still get paid, but he couldn't make any official decisions or represent the city until the ethics board finished their work. I felt a huge weight lift when I heard that news. For the first time in months, it seemed like we might actually win this fight. The new judge called another hearing to review all the criminal charges against the bikers. Naomi presented the body camera footage from the police officers who arrested them for loitering. The footage clearly showed the bikers carrying flour bags from the truck to the bakery door. They weren't just standing around or blocking anyone's path. The judge watched the video twice and then dismissed the loitering charges completely against two of the bikers. He said there was no probable cause for the arrests and the charges shouldn't have been filed in the first place. Carlos's knife case was more complicated because of the parole documentation issues. The prosecutor argued that Carlos hadn't properly registered the hunting knife when he first got out of prison. But the judge reduced the charge from a felony to a misdemeanor after reviewing the original parole paperwork. It turned out Carlos had mentioned the knife in his initial check-in, but someone at the parole office hadn't filed the form correctly. The judge said that was a technical problem, not a criminal act. Jeff's articles about the case caught the attention of the teenager's guardian. She read about how the bakery had been targeted and left vulnerable after the bikers were forced away. The guardian brought the kid to the police station, where he admitted to both the robbery and the vandalism. He told the police he'd heard people saying Rose's bakery was an easy target now that nobody was protecting it. The teenager seemed genuinely sorry about breaking Mrs. Rose's wrist, but sorry doesn't fix broken bones or erase trauma. The prosecutor called me to discuss what kind of plea deal we wanted. I told him I needed to talk to Mrs. Rose first because it was her decision to make. Mrs. Rose surprised me with her answer. She said she wanted the teenager to pay back the money he stole and the cost of fixing the damage he caused. She also wanted him to go to counseling to deal with whatever made him think robbing people were okay, but she didn't want him to go to jail for years and have his whole life ruined over one terrible choice. The prosecutor seemed relieved that we weren't asking for maximum punishment. He worked out a plea deal where the teen would do community service, pay restitution over time, and attend mandatory counseling sessions. The deal held him accountable, but also gave him a chance to turn things around. Mrs. Rose said she remembered being young and making mistakes, and she wanted to believe people could change if they got the right help. The state sent their own health inspector to do a complete review of the bakery. This inspector went through everything carefully and professionally, without any attitude or agenda. He checked the kitchen equipment, storage areas, prep surfaces, and all our documentation. After 3 hours, he told us the bakery was in full compliance with every health and safety code. There were a few minor upgrades we needed to make, like updating some fire extinguishers and adding better ventilation in one corner. But overall, everything passed inspection. We got approval to reopen on probationary status while we completed the required upgrades. I'll never forget the moment Mrs. Rose unlocked the front door and turned on the ovens again. She stood there crying happy tears for the first time in months. The smell of fresh bread baking filled the shop, and it felt like we were finally coming home after a long, terrible journey. The fundraiser happened faster than I expected. Jeff posted about our situation online, and within 3 days, a local church offered their parking lot for a weekend event. People showed up with cash donations, baked goods to sell, and offers to volunteer at the bakery, while Mrs. Rose healed. By Sunday afternoon, we counted $8,000, enough to cover the remaining fines and pay for the ventilation upgrades the state inspector required. A retired baker named Margaret signed up for morning shifts 3 days a week, and 2 college students took evening cleanup duty. Mrs. Rose cried again when I showed her the volunteer schedule, but this time it was relief mixed with gratitude. Carlos's hearing arrived 2 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom watching Mateo take the witness stand in his parole officer uniform. He explained that Carlos had properly declared the hunting knife in his initial parole paperwork back in 2019, showing the judge a copy of the original form with Carlos's signature and the supervising officer's stamp. The current violation stemmed from a database migration error that lost the declaration record, not from Carlos hiding anything. The prosecutor looked annoyed but didn't argue much. The judge reduced the charge to a technical breach, credited Carlos with time already served, and extended his parole supervision by 6 months instead of sending him back to prison. Carlos walked out of that courtroom looking 10 years younger. 3 days after the hearing, Carlos and I met at a diner 2 blocks from the bakery. We sat across from each other with coffee getting cold between us, while I apologized for pushing legal strategies without considering how scared he was of going back to prison. He admitted he'd been angry at me for treating his life like a case to win, instead of understanding what he was risking. We talked for 2 hours, working through the hurt feelings and misunderstandings that had built up during the crisis. By the end, we agreed to set up a morning coffee club in the public parking lot on 3rd Street, where the bikers could gather legally without violating any restraining orders or creating problems for Mrs. Rose. It wasn't the same as sitting on the bakery stoop, but it kept the group together and visible in the community. Naomi spent the next week negotiating with our landlord. He wanted to raise rent by $400 monthly, claiming his insurance costs had jumped because of all the police activity. Naomi countered by offering to use $3,000 from the fundraiser money for building improvements that would increase the property value, including new exterior lighting and repairs to the shared parking area. After several phone calls and one tense in-person meeting, they settled on a 2-year lease extension with a $200 monthly increase and the agreed improvements. It wasn't ideal, but it meant we could stay in our location and plan for the future. Governor Williams showed up at the bakery one Tuesday morning without any cameras or staff. She wore regular clothes and ordered a coffee and cinnamon roll just like any other customer. Mrs. Rose hugged her for a long time while I pretended to organize the pastry display. The governor sat at a corner table with Mrs. Rose for 30 minutes, talking quietly about old times and the current situation. Before leaving, she warned us that the ethics inquiry into Quimby would take many more months to fully resolve, and he would probably appeal any findings. Her visit felt like validation that we'd done things the right way, even when it was hard and slow. The bikers started volunteering at the county library's adult literacy program 6 weeks after the bakery reopened. Carlos reached out to the program coordinator and explained that he and his friends had learned to read as adults and wanted to help others do the same. They started teaching twice a week, working with people who struggled with reading and needed patient instructors who understood the shame and difficulty. Jeff wrote a follow-up story about their volunteer work that focused on redemption and second chances, showing how they contributed to the community instead of dwelling on their criminal pasts. The article got shared widely, and several people commented that they'd judged the bikers unfairly. Mrs. Rose got her cast removed after 3 months of wearing it. The doctor said her wrist had healed well, but she needed to start with light duty and build back up to full work gradually. She began working 4-hour morning shifts while I handled the afternoon and evening operations. We installed 3 visible security cameras covering the entrance, register, and back door. I started keeping detailed logs of every incident, every inspection, every interaction with city officials. We maintained regular contact with Naomi and Jeff, knowing we might need their help again if Quimby's allies tried anything new. Looking back after 4 months, I see that the bakery is open and operating with steady customer traffic. The bikers are freer and rebuilding their lives, with Carlos working full-time at a warehouse and volunteering at the library. Quimby is suspended from the office and facing serious ethics charges that could end his political career. We're still financially tight with the higher rent and ongoing medical bills, but we're stable and making enough to cover expenses. We didn't get perfect justice or complete victory over everyone who hurt us, but we kept our receipts, followed the process, documented everything, and we're still here serving coffee every morning to anyone who walks through the door. That's my side of the story, but it's way more fun when you add yours. What would you have done differently? Drop it in the comments. I'll be reading through them later. You always surprise me with your takes.